Ed Gein's childhood was far from ordinary, and the horrors that later defined his life as an infamous criminal can be traced back to the intense and controlling environment in which he grew up. Born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Ed was the second of two boys in a family that seemed outwardly typical, yet harbored deep dysfunction and darkness. His father, George Gein, was a largely absentee figure, quiet and unremarkable, but it was his mother, Augusta, who would cast the longest and most devastating shadow over his formative years. Augusta Gein was a deeply religious and fanatically moralistic woman whose rigid worldview and suffocating control over her children shaped the contours of Ed's psyche in ways that would later manifest in unimaginable ways. Augusta's life revolved around her children, but her love was conditional, extreme, and suffocating. She believed the world was filled with sin and vice and that men, in particular, were inherently corrupt and dangerous. She instilled in Ed a fear of women's sexuality, of socialization outside the home, and of moral contamination. She warned him endlessly about the dangers of alcohol, sexual immorality, and the outside world, cultivating an intense paranoia in her son. In her view, isolation and obedience were not only virtues but shields against eternal damnation. For Ed, this created a home that was as much a prison as it was a family. He was constantly aware that any misstep, any moment of curiosity, could bring punishment or spiritual peril. The Gein family lived on a farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and it was there that Ed spent most of his childhood. The farm was isolated, and Augusta ensured it remained that way, forbidding her children from forming meaningful friendships or interacting with the community in any meaningful way. Ed had little exposure to peers and the outside world, leaving him socially stunted and deeply impressionable. His world was confined to his mother, his father, and the bleak, lonely farm. In this environment, the normal developmental experiences of childhood, learning trust, understanding social norms, exploring curiosity, were replaced with fear, suspicion, and moralistic indoctrination. Augusta's influence extended to her teaching of sexuality and the human body. She instilled in Ed a deep-seated fear and confusion about sexual behavior. She told him that women were inherently sinful and dangerous, and she linked sexuality to evil, disease, and death. This caused Ed to associate natural human impulses with guilt and sin, creating a psychological tension between his innate curiosity and the moralistic terror his mother had instilled. This tension would later manifest in grotesque ways, as he struggled to reconcile his desires with the extreme moral code imposed by Augusta. The farm itself became a reflection of Augusta's personality, harsh, regimented, and cold. Ed's father died when he was a young boy, leaving him even more under his mother's control. Augusta ruled the household with strict rules and an iron will, ensuring that Ed remained under her supervision at all times. She discouraged him from forming any attachments outside the family, and she instilled a sense of fear that the outside world would corrupt him. Ed's days were spent performing chores on the farm, learning obedience, and internalizing the moral dogma his mother enforced. There was no room for emotional expression, play, or rebellion. Any deviation from her expectations was met with punishment or harsh reprimand. Even as a child, Ed began to internalize Augusta's lessons, and the effects on his psyche were profound. The combination of isolation, moral indoctrination, and constant fear produced a boy who was socially awkward, deeply insecure, and psychologically fragile. He learned to suppress emotions, hide his thoughts, and internalize guilt in ways that would later shape his behaviors as an adult. His mother's teachings about women, sexuality, and morality created a foundation of repression and confusion that would later explode in destructive ways. It is also important to understand the cultural context of the time. Rural Wisconsin in the early 20th century was a place where religious fervor, superstition, and strict moral codes were common. Augusta's extreme views, while not universally shared, were amplified by her isolationist lifestyle. Her influence on Ed was magnified by the absence of alternative perspectives and social interactions, leaving him with no reference point to challenge or question the rigid worldview he was taught. By the time Ed reached adolescence, the seeds of his later pathology had already been sown. He had learned to fear the world, distrust human relationships, and repress his natural impulses. His mother's influence was omnipresent, and the psychological damage of his upbringing created a fertile ground for the behaviors that would eventually terrify the nation. Living in fear under his mother's shadow was not just a childhood experience, it was the crucible that forged the man who would become one of America's most infamous criminals. Augusta's rigid control, her obsessive morality, and her paranoia about sin left Ed ill-equipped to navigate the world outside her oppressive presence, setting him on a path of isolation, obsession, and eventually, horror. In the end, Ed Gein's childhood illustrates how extreme parental influence, isolation, and fear can warp a developing mind. The combination of Augusta's fanatical beliefs, the lack of social interaction, and the harsh moral environment created a psychological pressure cooker that would later explode in ways that shocked the nation. What Netflix and popular media often overlook is the slow, insidious nature of this upbringing, the years of fear, suppression, and control that quietly molded a young boy into the infamous figure history remembers. Understanding this background provides a chilling, human context to Ed Gein's later crimes and shows how a twisted childhood can lay the groundwork for a life of unimaginable darkness. If you want, I can also expand the second episode in the same style and length. Do you want me to do that next? Ed Gein is one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, but the story of how he became the Butcher of Plainfield is far more complex than most portrayals show. While popular media often focuses on the gruesome crimes he committed in the 1950s, the seeds of his pathology were planted decades earlier in his formative years. Ed's early life was marked by neglect, fear, and a suffocating obsession with morality, all imposed by his mother, Augusta Gein. These formative experiences, which Netflix and other dramatizations tend to gloss over, are crucial to understanding how a boy from a small Wisconsin farm could grow into a man capable of shocking the nation. Ed's childhood was dominated by Augusta, a deeply religious and fanatically moralistic woman whose worldview was rigid and oppressive. Augusta's influence was absolute. She instilled in her children an extreme fear of sin, corruption, and the outside world, particularly targeting the idea of sexual behavior as something inherently sinful and dangerous. Her teachings were not gentle lessons in morality, they were authoritarian rules enforced with constant fear and intimidation. Ed absorbed these lessons without question, internalizing his mother's paranoia and moral rigidity. By the time he reached adolescence, he had developed a worldview in which the natural impulses of curiosity, desire, and social engagement were equated with evil, shame, and danger. The isolation Ed experienced was also pivotal. The Gein farm was secluded, and Augusta made sure it remained that way. She discouraged her children from forming friendships, discouraged participation in the local community, and strictly controlled their interactions with anyone outside the family. This isolation deprived Ed of normal social development. He had no peers with whom he could share experiences or compare feelings, leaving him socially awkward and psychologically dependent on his mother's approval. The lack of socialization meant he had few outlets for frustration, fear, or curiosity. Instead, these emotions simmered within him, unprocessed and often distorted, building a foundation for abnormal behavior later in life. Another factor that shaped Ed's psyche was Augusta's obsessive control over household life and her tyrannical enforcement of routines and rules. Chores, religious observances, and moral instruction dominated every day, leaving little room for personal freedom. Ed learned that obedience was survival and that deviation from his mother's standards was dangerous. Over time, this created a duality in his mind, outwardly compliant, yet inwardly repressed. The repression of normal desires, combined with constant exposure to extreme moralistic instruction, became a psychological pressure cooker. This duality would later manifest in troubling and violent ways, as he struggled to reconcile natural impulses with the rigid moral code instilled in him. Sexuality and human intimacy were particularly warped in Ed's upbringing. Augusta's teachings about women were extreme and fear-based. She described them as deceitful, dangerous, and sources of corruption, fostering in Ed a conflicted understanding of female anatomy and desire. He was simultaneously terrified of women and fascinated by them, creating an obsessive and pathological interest that later influenced his crimes. His understanding of the human body was filtered through fear, obsession, and the lens of sin, laying the groundwork for the grotesque acts he would commit in adulthood. Netflix adaptations often skip these psychological roots, opting instead to sensationalize the crimes themselves, but it was this twisted education that directly influenced his later actions. The death of Ed's father, George Gein, when Ed was still a boy, further intensified his dependency on Augusta and magnified the impact of her teachings. Without a moderating figure in the household, Augusta's influence became absolute. Her rigid worldview went unchallenged, and Ed was left with no alternative perspectives. The isolation and domination by Augusta created a psychological environment in which Ed's perception of the world was filtered entirely through fear, moral judgment, and an obsessive attention to control and secrecy. These early experiences produced a child who was deeply insecure, socially inept, and psychologically fragile, fertile ground for the development of extreme behavior in later years. The physical environment of the farm itself played a role in shaping Ed's imagination and obsessions. The rural setting, with its seclusion, decaying structures, and proximity to death in the form of farm animals and burial sites, reinforced the themes of mortality, decay, and obsession with the human body that would later appear in his crimes. The farm was a controlled space, but it was also a place where morbid curiosity could fester in isolation, unchallenged by the norms of broader society. The combination of Augusta's moral strictures and the farm's isolation provided a unique context in which Ed's repressed impulses could develop in dangerous ways. What Netflix often misses is that Ed Gein's transformation into a criminal was not sudden. It was the result of decades of conditioning, fear, isolation, and obsession. His early life demonstrates how an oppressive, morally rigid, and isolating environment can warp a developing mind. The psychological scars left by his mother's teachings, combined with a lack of social exposure and emotional nurturing, set him on a trajectory toward behaviors that were increasingly detached from societal norms. Ultimately, understanding Ed Gein's early life reveals that monsters are often created, not born. His mother's overbearing control, religious fanaticism, and obsessive moral instruction, combined with the isolation of rural life and the absence of healthy social relationships, created a child who was unequipped to navigate the world in a healthy way. These factors, largely overlooked in popular portrayals, are essential to understanding the man behind the crimes. The true horror of Ed Gein's story is not just the acts he committed as an adult, but the years of psychological shaping and repression that turned a vulnerable child into one of the most notorious figures in criminal history. Netflix shows the gruesome results, but the origins, the subtle, insidious influences of a childhood lived under a mother's shadow, tell the story that society often ignores, revealing the chilling human context behind his monstrous actions. If you want, I can now also create image prompts, SEO description, tags, and hashtags for both episodes to complete the full content package like in your previous requests. Do you want me to do that?